All right, so in this video, what we're going to do is keep talking about Mograph, and this time around, talk about field layers. Now, field layers are additional ways we can control our effectors, but rather than using fields, we can use other object types in Cinema 4D. This could be particle systems, it can be geometry, splines, among other things. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So here's just one of the things we're going to talk about here where I'm using a simple matrix object. I have a um, text object, 3D geometry here for a text, all right, which I'm using to control the strength of this plane effector, which is moving these matrix cubes as well as scaling them down a little bit. And then on top of that, because the text itself is a MoGraph object, I've added a plane effector to it, scaling the text up and down, which then allows me to come in here and use this linear field to control the text appearing and disappearing. And if it make a little bit more sense, if I just start with the text, so that's all we're doing here, basic setup, adding in a matrix object, and that is the end result. So like I said, this is just one of the things we're going to be seeing how we can do. Let's go ahead and start a new scene file. I'm going to start by creating a matrix object. Now, a matrix object is another one of our MoGraph generators. I'm using it in this particular case because it's a little bit lighter weight, more responsive than, say, a cloner. I'm just going to keep it with the default grid setup, but you can see it has a lot of the same properties as a cloner. And what we're going to do is create a plane effector. And that plane effector should be applied to our matrix as long as we had it selected when we created it. You can double check that in the effectors tab here by just making sure our plane effector is seen in that list. And if it isn't, just dragging it in there. Now the default value on our plane effector is moving this up on the y-axis. Okay, this could be whatever we want, could be position, could be rotation, scale, any combination. And then what we would typically do is go into the fields section and add some kind of field objects, whether it's a linear field, box field, sphere, you name it. These are for the most part, what we would use to control the strength of this effector and how it gets applied to our matrix or other MoGraph object. However, we have these other options here in our field layers. And if you just take a look at these, you will see that these are representative of a lot of the different object types we have available to us in Cinema 4D. Channel Convert works with colors. MoGraph object does another MoGraph object like text or a fracture, Voronoi fracture, that type of thing. A particle object, so an emitter. Point object, really any piece of geometry. Solid, that's really just kind of like a white solid or black solid, depending on how you set it up with the blending modes. A spline object, step, time, variable tag, which is really just, there's a few different tags you could add in here. Selection tags, I believe you can do it with material tags as well, among others. And lastly, a volume object. So we'll go through quite a few of these and just see some of the different things we can do with that. Let's start with a particle object. And so rather than starting by adding a particle object here because, well, it really doesn't work. Instead, what you want to do is create those types of objects and then drag them into our field list here. And so I'm going to do that by coming up here to my Simulate menu, choosing Emitter, and creating just a basic particle emitter. This isn't X particles or anything like that, unfortunately, just a normal particle emitter from Cinema 4D. I'm going to rotate this so that the particles are shooting downwards. So we get something like that. Great, maybe even scale it a bit larger, about the size of our matrix there. And great. Now what we can do is in our plane effector in the fields tab here, come in and drop our emitter in here. And you can choose whether to do a particle object or a point object. And since I don't really have this emitting a piece of geometry, I'm going to go with particle object, but point object can work as well. And you'll see now we get these particles as they pass through working as a field and controlling our plane effector. So as these particles pass through, a number of our matrix cubes here get affected by it, just as if a particle was a little kind of spherical or cylindrical field. Now, if you select the emitter, you can see you can control the radius here. All right, so this radius allows you to control how big of an area around that particle you want this to be. Now, if I really was doing something like this, obviously the plane effector is going up way too high. All right, though it does depend what you're trying to kind of achieve here. Okay, maybe something like that. And just for fun, while we're here, we could come into our modifier layers and choose a delay. You can see even the smooth here does kind of smooth things out. But if we were to get crazy and say add a spring, turn off clamping here, you can see we get some nice, interesting movement. We get nice look to this matrix object without really having to do a whole lot. And, because the emitter has such properties like start emission and stop emission, variation, we could have this go for however long or short we need it to. So that's a look at using an emitter here for our really kind of field layer. Okay, so that's one way or one object type we can use. So I'll get rid of that. I'm going to keep our plane effector, though I also want to get rid of that particle object and the delay because we're going to move on now. Another option could be a point object. And so let's create a text object like I had before. So there's our text. I'm going to just switch the font to something a little bit more bold. So I believe I had Franklin Gothic Heavy before, but any font you have will work. Obviously, the more of these cubes that fit inside of our text, the more detailed we're going to be able to get here. And so that's where using the matrix object can be helpful because, like I said, it's a little bit lighter weight. You can create more of them before your system starts to slow down. And so not a bad idea to use that, at least just for testing purposes before maybe switching over to a cloner. Just like I did previously, once I've done kind of creating this object, I can now drag it into our fields list here, and it will get added as a field layer. We can choose whether we want point object or Mograph object. I'm going to choose point object for today. Right now, I'm going to hide the text so we can see it a little bit better. And this is what we get. A big thing with this text object, and some of these things by default, is you want to see what mode it's being used in, because right now it's only affecting our matrix object based on its proximity to the points that are in this text object. And for some of these letters, there really aren't that many points, right? Like the T and the X. E, T a little bit better, but because of that intermediate points type, we don't have something very even. And if that's the case, then perhaps this point mode here is not going to be the best option. Maybe we should do something like surface. And you can start to see the text a little bit there. If I turn down the radius just a bit, we might be able to get a little bit more clarity here. Let's do a couple of other things though. I feel like the color we're getting is not very easy to see. So we can work with that, though that is a little bit due to the strength here. So let's go back to the layer options and we can kind of work with that a little bit more to see more of that color. All right, so we can see the text coming through. It's almost like it's too bold in this particular case, but part of that too is the size of these matrix cubes, or just how many of them are fitting inside here. So if I was to scale this down and then make more of them, right, you can see things appear a little bit clearer there, right? Back in here, plane, maybe reduce the radius a little bit as well. You want to make sure the text is kind of like in there where it needs to go. Yeah, so we're getting something a little bit easier to read with that. And that is with the mode set to surface. So as long as it touches the surface, you could also do volume. This is where it actually does help to be able to see this, because you can see it absolutely needs to be inside of this. And now we can see our text quite a bit more clear. And once again, like I said in the opening example, because this text object itself can have effectors applied to it, we could then add our plane effector. Instead of position, choose scale and uniform scale. Set that to -1. Add our linear field. And that's what we were moving before to get this to kind of pop up. Now you would also want to hide that text object so that we just see the end result with our matrix. Okay, so that's our text object. I think I covered all the modes here, but let's just double check. Let's see. We also have curvature. That one's a little bit interesting. You can get some fun details with it depending on what mode you use and the settings you get. It's a little bit tricky though, so I think maybe I'll save this for another video at some point down the line. So that is our text object. Next, or our point object, I should say. Next, we'll use a spline object, and we're just gonna keep this going here by creating a text spline. Okay, actually, text spline. There we go. Just keep that as text. I'll switch this to Franklin Gothic Heavy again. And what you're going to see is some very similar options here. Once I rotate this, position it back over our matrix object, and then drag it into our effector. I'm sorry, our field list here is a field layer. Now with the text spline, you have a couple of different options for how you want this to work. One is the curve. So it's working with the curve itself. And you can see we are getting a little bit of our text there. It's somewhat visible to read if you knew exactly what it was saying. Okay. But ultimately though, if you are going to use curve, you may want to use something like radius. And just like we've seen before, radius, now it's basing it on our curve. So that's why it's only kind of outlined like this as opposed to solid. Okay, so radius, along and radius, which is kind of interesting. A little bit of a combination there. And then you can also use this as a mask. So very much like we were seeing with our point object, whether we wanted it to be on the surface or volume. That's essentially what we have here. What's important with this when you're using the mask option here is the projection, and to get that axis correct. Now, the local axis here is actually the Z. That's why this is working. But world-wise, this is along the Y-axis. But because I rotated it, that's why this is what we need to use. But make sure your projection axis is on the right, is set up correctly. You can work with your fall off, whether you want that to fall off from the inside or outside, and then the distance as well, which can soften things up. And now we have something that looks quite a bit better than what we were actually seeing, even with our polygon or point object that we were seeing previously. Okay. And what's nice is, like I said, you can combine these together. I could use this text spline along with a emitter, okay, like we saw previously, to create even more complex Mograph animations. On top of that, we also have our step field layer, and I'll just leave that here because the step field layer, and even turn off the text spline, is very much like the step effector with a little bit less control, but it's the same general idea. So step effector here allows you to incrementally make things larger or smaller. And typically what it does, I set this to normal, come back here to the parameter tab, it's going to incrementally change whatever properties you've set here. Now, what can be a bit tricky is the direction it's going here. And so what we're seeing is it's moving up our cubes, our matrix cubes, along the y-axis incrementally until it gets to our max value. All right. And that's where, do this with our text, and we can see both kind of working here. All right. Step. The issue with it, though, is you are a little bit limited with it. You can't specify along what direction very easily. Any of that, it doesn't really have its own properties. It's based off of what you're doing in this effector. So that could be scale. It could be uniform scale. And kind of same thing here where as we're doing this, they're incrementally getting smaller and smaller, starting from our original cube all the way down to our last one. Are these intersecting? I guess lines wouldn't help here, but let's see. Per step, I didn't think they were, but it looks like they might be. although we're still getting some really interesting effects because even with that. So we'll just move on. But kind of the one downside of the step here, and why I do think it can work on its own, right? If you clip, now each thing inside is, getting incrementally smaller. All right. So if you saw my video on blending modes, then you should have a little bit better idea of how these work. But once again, it's really meant to be used in conjunction with something else. Really, same is true for the time um, layer as well. And once again, this is similar to our time effector. If you've used that, perhaps not quite as many controls. You can see that it is, oops, lost it. Doing what we have set up here, in this case, scaling things down. All right. Without a shape at the moment, we'll talk about those. At a rate of 30 frames, so it's going to finish getting to these values after 30 frames, with an offset as well that you can add. So if I want this to be longer, I can make this longer. Now, over the course of 90 frames, it's going to scale things down. All right, now what you can do, aside from using blending modes here, is also have a shape here. And this is very much like the track before, track after type things, where it's using these particular shapes to kind of repeat or continue our pattern. So sine wave is essentially there and back. Triangle is that, but perhaps not as smooth. Okay, these things are definitely intersecting there. Sawtooth. So it keeps going, and then very quickly resets back to its original size, very much like a saw. And then square, which is really just kind of like step interpolation here. So once again, interesting when used in conjunction with other layers. Once again, if I just put it in clip, you can see it's really just the ones in the middle there. Let's take a step away that are scaling down. Okay, so almost a little bit of a pixelation or blur effect we have going on with this particular setup. Okay, I'm not going to get into the variable tags here or using other tags like selection tags for text maps. I believe even material tags as well, like I said. But we also have volume objects. And just to kind of show that, because it is pretty straightforward, it's similar to our spline and our geometries. I'll just take this text spline and put it in a, let's see, volume builder. Let's hide this for now. Put this into a volume mesher, although I guess it wouldn't need to be in the volume builder or in the volume mesher, but let's turn that down. Perhaps that's a bit too far down. There we go. And let's see, I may actually want this to be kind of solid. Yeah, so let's put this into an extrude then. There we go. Just so we can see this. So we have our volume builder here. Let's smooth this out a lot. Create some interesting looking text there, something with a little bit of soft edge, and can run into a lot of the same issues you run into when creating volume objects if you don't have things set up correctly. So I think that's obviously way too many iterations there. So now we have some nice soft text, and I can drag that into our field list as a point object. All right, or really, actually, we don't want it as a point object so much as we want it as a volume object. Perfect. Let's turn our matrix back on, and we may need to turn some other things on just to get an idea of what this looks like a little bit easier. There we go. So, okay, that's what we're getting. It's almost like it's the opposite there, but let's hide this. All right, so, okay. I don't think I was upside down. Interestingly, this almost looks like a normal map. And now the fact that these are intersecting is a little bit more problematic. So it almost looks like these would be 10. Oops. Just trying to copy and paste that there. Did not go well. There we go. So you can see it's kind of working as a volume object in our fields list here with our different options. We have different sample modes like we've seen previously. And with this as well, we want to make sure it's positioned in our object, in between our object like we would like to see. And this absolutely looks like more of a normal map. So interesting kind of effect and can be used for a variety of purposes with this. So that will do it for this video as we dived into our different field layers. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If there's anything else you would like to see, please let me know and take care.